Hello and welcome to I Miss Book Club. I'm your host, Veronica Reynolds, and I have a recurring co-host back with me this week, Joe Barbieri. Thanks for joining me, Joe.
Hi there, glad to be here.
And this week I don't have to grill you on books that made you because you've already shared them on a previous episode, which I recommend going back and listening to. Joe is our local history librarian, so I figured I'd treat him for the holidays and to tell history to him instead of him having to tell history to other people. That's my holiday gift to you, Joe.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I love all kinds of history, not just local history. So I know this is going to be fun.
So what we're going to talk about today is a talk I've given a couple of times, actually. Try and make it a little bit more fun, a little bit more interactive today. Joe is your audience stand-in, but I have given this talk a couple times. It's on the history of the English language, and it's just something I'm really passionate about. My qualifications are very lean. It's just that I was a minor in English literature in college, and I took this class, and then I TA'd this class because I liked it so much. And then I also went on to take a class in both Old English and Chaucer. So this is something I took some undergrad coursework in.
I think that makes you pretty qualified.
Yeah, I took that course like years ago, so it's really recent. Just like yesterday, super fresh in my mind. But I don't know, it's something I just really love. I won't do the enormous background I usually do on like the history of language, period. But I do want to talk a little bit about England before English, because of course England was not always England. And in case you're wondering how you get a history of colonization, it's by starting off with colonization, because before there were anything like something called an English person in England, there was the Celts and the Britons. We don't really know a lot about them, especially, that's not true. We know a lot about them, but not much prior to BCE, 800 BCE. The Celts occupied not only England, but a lot of Europe. And weirdly, despite that dominance, they have very little impact on English, except for a few words, which are not super common now, but mostly like geographic words like which is a word for valley, crag, and one that you and I are familiar with, tor.
Oh.
The tor is actually a Celt-Briton word. So it starts off with the first colonization of England, which is the entrance of the Romans, who enter into Britain in 55 BCE under Julius Caesar, a name you might be familiar with.
I've heard of that guy in history before.
Yeah. And their occupation has this huge impact on the culture and religion, the geography, the architecture, the social behavior of Britain. Some of the walls that went up at that time still define cities in England today. But again, at this point, we don't get a big impact on language. That comes later. We get a handful of loan words, which are words that are just like it sounds like, on loan from other languages. The big thing that causes what we would call the birth of, I get to get my little soapbox. So everybody calls Shakespeare Old English. Like, I don't understand it. It's Old English. And I get it. It is hard to access and it can be archaic, but that's not Old English. That's modern English, just early modern English, which we'll talk about. But Old English does not sound like a language that we can easily wrap our heads around. Old English is hoer quam mego, hoer quam hus. Where is the horse and where is the rider? Which may be Lord of the Rings fans. Because as reasons we'll get to, Tolkien was a big Old English person and used a lot of it in his writing. But the reason it sounds like that is it's actually a Germanic language, because in 430 CE, Celtic warlord Vortigern invited the Jute brothers Hengist and Horsa to settle on the coast of Britain to help defend against sea raids by the Picts, which was another group that was living in the area. And what were called the Angles begin to settle on the east coast of Britain, and then the Frisian people also began to encroach on the British mainland. So this is when I asked you, Joe, a trivia question. What do you think is this not yet extinct language that is closest to English, the language that is closest to English, period, actually, in the world?
I would venture, I would say like German or Dutch, maybe?
Very close. So it's actually Frisian, which is one of those tribes I just mentioned. So Frisian is only at this point spoken by about 1,000 people, but it is quite close to English because it has very similar roots, including the fact they settled on this coast. And so they were all speaking variations on a West Germanic tongue, which is very close to modern Frisian. So the Celts fight against these invasions over generations. This is happening over a fairly long period of time. But as they settle, the Germanic tribes start to form kingdoms, and some of these names may sound familiar. The kingdoms are Essex, Wessex, Sussex, Angles, America, Northumbria, and Jutes. And the evidence of this settling is still in the place name. So Ing means people of, and you get Worthing, Reading, Hastings.
Oh.
Yeah, right? Ton is closure village, so you get Tanton, Burton, Luton. Ford meaning a river crossing, so Ashford, Bradford, Watford. Ham meaning farm, and if you've ever been to England, there's a lot of hams. Nottingham, Birmingham, we know a lot of hams. Yeah. And stead meaning like a site, like Hampstead. And of course, because we are English settled in a lot of places, we have a lot of those names in America too.
Yeah.
So those are very old names, and those kingdoms lasted, of course. Yeah, so that's usually one of the biggest impacts of place names, right?
Oh, cool. So right next door we have New Hampstead, right next to New City, and there we go. So there's a... Yeah.
Exactly. Hampstead's right there. So all these British names that got imported over to us a lot of them have roots in these really early pieces of English. Because what happens is we have the Angles and we have the Saxons. So what do we get? We get the Anglo-Saxons. And it's under... Once Albion and the Britannia are under the Romans, they became known as Angloland or Ingloland, the land of the Angles, and that becomes England. So that's a slow arrival at that word. And then by 600 CE, English has become a distinct language instead of a Germanic dialect. So that takes place. It takes a long time. And then there's major dialects of Old English. They are not all the same. There's Northumbrian, there's American in the Midlands, West Saxon in the north and west, and Kentish in the southeast. And all of these languages still exist in the accents of these areas. So if you know anything about England, you know that the accents are very distinct from place to place. And a lot of that comes all the way back to 600 CE when these were actually different kingdoms, essentially. So they were using runes to write, so they did have a written language, and that's how we know a lot of the what remains. A lot of the time they weren't writing on paper. We were getting this on wood or stone, which means it lasts a long time, which is really helpful. So the first known written English sentence reads, "This she-wolf is a reward to my kinsmen." We find it on a gold medallion in Suffolk that dates to about 450 CE. So. Oh,
wow. Well, there you go. There's a great first...
Right, really relatable. I give you this wolf. It was probably a dog, actually, if you think about it. It's probably a receipt for a hunting animal.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Christianity, of course, impacts this pretty majorly. You have St. Augustine and his 40 missionaries from Rome bringing Christianity to the pagan Anglo-Saxons and the rest of England in 597 CE. There were practicing Christians in England prior to that, but this is like the big push to Christianize England. They adopt the new Roman alphabet, but they bring with them some of their runes, like the Win, which is the one that looks kind of like a slanted P, the Thorn, which is the more upright, but like the P part is kind of in the middle, if you know what I'm talking about. The F, which looks like a D that's kind of fallen over and has a cross on it, and Yod, which looks like an italicized 3. One of the reasons those are brought along is they're useful for sound. It was also to do with how you had to write things. So you had to be very careful not to break your quill. So this carries over into Middle English as well. When you see these like Christian monks who have the very slanted handwriting, anything time you wanted to put like a curly Q on something, you had to be really careful not to break your quill tip. So F's and S's were actually elongated, and that's how the thorn actually continues to last for a while, so that they were kind of escaping writing some of those curly Q S's.
Oh, so there's like a practical reason, not just a... Okay, so there's... Yeah, cool.
Right, especially if you're... I'm making a hand gesture here, which is not helpful, but if you're grinding into stone, thinking about like trying to do a curve as opposed to an up and down.
Yeah, that makes sense why the runes would be a little more, angular and... Okay, very cool.
Yeah, it's like an example of like language being shaped by purpose, right?
Mm-hmm.
Latin at this time still just a minor influence on English. That does change, but all the church dignitaries and ceremonies like priest, vicar, altar, mass, all those kinds of words enter into English from that go around. And then we start to get into, like, we actually have lasting works. The first, like, recorded work is called Cadman's Hymn, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a prayer. But there's a story that goes with it, because we know about Cadman's prayer from one of the early English historians, a guy you may be familiar with. His name is Bede.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, the Venerable Bede, I think he's often called. He was a historian from 670. He was alive about 673 to 735 CE. And he preserved all of Cadman's work, but he also wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, which he wrote in Latin, but there's a lot of bits of Anglo-Saxon culture left in it, including he did preserve Cadman's work in Old English. There's a little bit of poetry from this age that I always like to share. I have it in translation, obviously, because I think it really captures the fact that humanity is always kind of thinking about the same things, which I find really fascinating. We talk about the immortality of Shakespeare, but here's a poem that's probably from about 500 CE.
Okay.
Sparrow flying in at one door, and immediately out at another, whilst he is within, is safe from the wintry tempest, but after a short space of fair weather, he immediately vanishes out of your sight, passing from winter to winter again. So this life of man appears for a little while, but of what it is to follow or what went before, we know nothing at all.
Ooh.
Right?
Yeah.
And we've always been really concerned about mortality.
Yeah.
How we're going and how we're coming out. And he's writing a priestly history of the English people, so you'd think it would be like a religious statement, but he's really saying, like, we don't know what comes before or after. Like, that's the great mystery, right?
Yeah. Very, very universal theme. There you go. You're right.
Right. Like, that could have been written yesterday. I mean, obviously I'm not reading it in the Old English, which would make it sound a little bit more archaic, but I mean, the sentiment is so similar. So the other thing that really preserves a lot of Old English at this point is the AngloSaxon Chronicle, which is just a historical record. So it was actually a historical text. It's a bunch of them. All the surviving versions we have are later copies. But the oldest one was written 891 CE, and there's later ones that go all the way up to 1100 CE. It's the only text that describes the history of England from the Romans to the Norman conquest. That's contemporary. I won't bore you by reading the entire text, but if you want an example of how this would have sounded, here's a little sentence. See, I'm going to not be as good as a professor reading this, obviously, so have some pity. Her theron reddeth for Bankna, Cumen, Ulfer, Norda Hambra land, that folk, Ermlich Bredon, Theron Ornet von Dennis. Here were dreadful forewarnings come over the land of Northumbria, and woefully terrified of the people.
Ooh.
So this is actually about the first Viking raid on Lindseford.
I was going to say, that sounds very ominous.
Yeah, not great. So there was a big Viking problem that the Anglo-Saxons had, which leads to, I don't think I have it in here, so I'll just tell this off the cuff because it's my favorite. My favorite king of all time is only recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, and he's only my favorite because he has the worst, best nickname of all time. That's Athelred the Unready. And it wasn't really Ethelred's fault. He just did not see Ethelred. It's not his fault. He didn't know the Vikings were gonna storm the Bastille. He might have been able to guess, and he was just not really prepared. You can imagine things didn't go well for him. But now he's just known that we'll never know whatever his other policies were. He was just unready for Vikings.
Yeah. So there you go. The moral of the story is always try to prepare for Vikings, lest you get a bad nickname.
Yeah, I have anti-Viking protection on my house, as you should do. Anti-Viking deterrents, right there with flood deterrents. So the most famous Old English poem, which I'm sure you're aware of, is Beowulf, of course. It's another piece of surviving writing from this era. It could have been written between the 8th to the 11th century. We don't really know. We don't know if it was multiple authors. We have no idea. We have one manuscript, and it has a mix of Northumbrian, West Saxon, and Anglian dialects. So it's pretty likely that it was pieced together. Remembering, of course, at this time that oral history was really important, and people were probably often reciting these more than they were writing them down. It uses 36 different words for hero, 20 for man, 12 for battle, 11 for ship. So it's already showing off this huge vocabulary that English still boasts to this day. It does not rhyme, because that's not how poetry worked in Old English. It was strict rules of alliteration. So Beowulf would have been an alliterative poem.
Okay.
And this is where Tolkien comes in, because up till Tolkien, so Tolkien was a language professor before he was an author, or simultaneously, I should say. And he was obsessed with language, which is why if you've read any of the Lord of the Rings books, you know that he made up vast quantities of languages, but those languages he made up were based in very real languages, especially primarily Old English, because he was very interested in it. For instance, the word ent just meant tree in Old English.
Oh, okay. So that's just a straight, just
Old English word. Was a meeting. So if you have an entmoot, tree meeting, that was like you have that big meeting of the tree people. A lot of the words that he used for in fact, calling it Middle Earth is an extremely Old English thing, because we didn't say Earth. You said Mittengod, which was Middle Earth, as in between heaven and hell. We were.
Oh, cool. There's another one I can, just keep in my back pocket for the cocktail parties to impress,
Impress people who are impressed by Lord of the Rings facts. I do it all the time. It depends on who you hang out with.
Yeah.
The quality of your friends are the Old English nerds who will be impressed by that. You have to find the sweet spot, though. Someone's going to be impressed by that, but wouldn't already know that. So
yeah.
a small group there. But what Tolkien did that really revolutionized the study of Old English is that he said we shouldn't just be looking at Beowulf as a vocabulary mine, because previous to that, they were really only studying Beowulf to pull words out of it, to be like, oh, this means that, we can tell in context it means that. Tolkien was really one of the first scholars, I think it would have been in the early 40s, but I could be wrong, I don't have the paper in front of me, who says, well, no, there's like stuff to be learned about the culture in this poem. And really starts pulling heavily out of that things that we can infer. Like one of the things that becomes pretty clear if you've read Old English poetry is that there was very much a feudal system where you had what they called a treasure lord. So this was especially true of like a Viking culture where they were raiding, where you had one guy who was like kind of in charge, and he had, instead of a castle, he had what's called a mead hall, where people would hang out, sleep, party, and a lot of his men probably would basically essentially live in the mead hall to some extent or another. It was like a big communal kitchen, so everyone would eat there. They would disperse the treasure, and that's who you pledged your fealty to. So, like, these kingdoms were a lot smaller, and there was a lot of lordships within them, which would give rise to the feudal system that we become pretty aware of later on. So, a lot of that's talked about in Beowulf.
I think that's one of the things that's really fascinating about languages to me is, and I think the first time maybe you realize it is when you take a foreign language and it's like, oh, well, there is no word for that. And you realize how much the culture, this culture, they don't really have, or they have this expression instead, or we would say, this or that. But, they will use this expression, and you kind of realize things are important or maybe not important, or maybe even don't exist, that they've had to borrow a word or use a loan word for, because there is no. And I think that's something that's kind of always been, just as a person who likes libraries and books and things like that, and really, really interesting. So, all right, I'll let you get back onto the main story.
No, I love that. In fact, I have one for you. If you want to appreciate different cultures having different phrases, you know how we say it's raining cats and dogs, which sounds really inhumane?
Yeah.
In Wales, when it's raining really hard, they say it's raining elderly ladies and sticks.
Oh.
What?
Wow. So what are the origins of that one?
I have no idea. I was Googling, like, what are fun phrases, and that one came up, and I was like, what? I think the whole phrase is hang a violin on the roof, it's raining, it's told women in sticks. I assume the sticks are like their canes in this case.
Yeah, that's kind of what I figured too.
Anyway, that's not Old English, it's just Welsh, modern Welsh sayings. I like that one. I mean, cats and dogs is horrible too, but that one really took me back. Anyway, so we think Beowulf was probably just written to entertain people. Yeah. So I've got a little bit of Beowulf here, but we'll skip along. There's a bunch of other poems that, if you're interested, you can find. Just Google Old English poetry. I'm a big fan, though, of, there's one called The Wanderer. That's where Hoerquem Mego, Hoerquem Hus, where's the horse and the rider, comes from, which is a poem about a guy who's treasure lord and most of his brothers in arms die, and he's just wandering the world. There's one called The Wife's Lament, and that's an interesting word evolution, because wifa in Old English just means woman. It doesn't mean wife. Word for wife. So that's one of those words that has definitely changed. Oh, and okay, I do have to talk about this poem because so I don't happen to be Christian. I'm Jewish, but it's very heavily Christianized language at this point. And there's this really interesting Old English poem called "The Dream of the Rood." You know what a rood is?
No.
It's specifically the cross that Jesus was hung on.
Okay.
The Dream of the Rood is written from the perspective of the cross at the crucifixion.
Oh.
So it's our first like big interesting POV poem where it has like an interesting point of view.
Yeah.
From the perspective of the tree. So it's like this kind of the tree that becomes the cross. And, like, it's such an artistic choice. So when we think of this kind of like old crabby men writing poetry, this was like a really dreamy, interesting poem, like from an unusual perspective. It's just cool that like they about things that way,
Very avant-garde.
Yeah, in a way that you kind of don't expect from people who are like, and then a monster came and you beat him with sticks. It just goes to show you that you always have your like high art people and your action hero people. Because Beowulf's an action hero, right? He's like a monster slaughterer.
Yeah.
And then you've got the Dream of the Rood, and you've got people kind of thinking like, what if I was a tree? And I think
there's your art house cinema right there.
Right. So the next big thing that happened to English is the next big thing that happens to England, period, which is in 1026. Do you know what happens in 1026, Joe? I'll do your it's
1026. Well, that's not Hastings, right? That's 1099.
The Norman conquest, baby.
Okay.
1026, you get William the Conqueror invading from Britain. So yeah, absolutely. And he wins handily. He takes all the property away from the Anglo-Saxon earls, gives them to the Normans and some of the English. And these invaders spoke a rural dialect of French that also had Germanic influences called Anglo-Norman or Norman French. So it was not the French they were speaking in Paris at the time. So we're still talking about like not particularly unified countries, right? They're very split.
Yeah, not countries that we think of countries and states today, right? They're a little more loosey-goosey, right?
Yeah, I mean, there is no Germany at this point. There's a lot of, kingdoms that make up Germany. France, the borders are changing pretty often. So what we get here is this really interesting class divide now, where the ruling class speaks this French dialect, and the lower classes all speak Old English. And it's a very slow process to get them to smush together. Also why, if you've ever cursed English spelling, this is where it really begins to get bad. Because now you've got a Germanic-rooted language meeting a Latin-rooted influence language, right, in French. And we start to get all of the cool words that don't make any sense if you're spelling things Germanically. The estimation is that there's 10,000 words of English that come directly from the Norman French. Court, judge, justice, money, gown, boot, beauty, mirror, jewel, art, color, the word language, literature, and poet are just some examples. Then you get this really interesting thing where some words are added to English as synonyms, often with the Norman version seeming higher class, which, by the way, we still feel sometimes to this day. My favorite being amity versus friendship.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Battle to fight, liberty to freedom. So we actually still kind of quote some of these as probably more highbrow words, like saying liberty instead of freedom. You're definitely trying to make a point, right?
Yeah.
That's still true to this day, even though we don't know why anymore. And then some of them now exist in tandem in common phrases, which I love this. Law and order. Lore and master. Love and cherish. Ways and means. So in both all those phrases, one is the Norman word and one is the original Old English word.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Words. Oh, and then so there's this KW sound in Anglo-Norman and now in English. That is not the K sound you were getting in Parisian French, and that's why we have quit, question, and quarter.
Oh.
It was originally all with this KW sound. Because one thing I should say about Old English, spelling was a lot easier because there was no formalized spelling. That didn't exist. We don't get formalized spelling in English until the 1500s. Even then, it's kind of spotty because you need the printing press to formalize spelling. We'll talk about it a little later, but it becomes a lot harder when you start bringing in the French words. And now the pronunciation shifts as well, because up until this point, you said every letter in a word. It wasn't knife, it was knief. It wasn't squire, it was squeer. you said every letter. So you were saying qui, quit, question, quarter, very likely. You were pronouncing every letter. It's only as the French incorporates in more that we start having silent letters. That wasn't a thing. You didn't need silent letters because you weren't spelling anything anyway except phonetically. So how it sounded to your ear was how you would have
how you spelled it.
Yeah. The Normans tended to also use suffix like er and or instead of the French eri and ori, so that the English had words like victory instead of victor and salary as opposed to salary. So that's when you start getting those changes and we start moving away from classic French. Like I said, we didn't have a ton of anyway. And French scribes also in writing down English changed the letter pattern from hua. So you would have said huat, huit, to wh. So huat comes what. Where becomes where, when becomes when, will becomes while. So you get these kind of, I apologize for pronouncing all those things weird, but I'm trying to emphasize the difference. So hard to hear. So that silent H basically disappears. And then during the Norman years, English is a third language after French and Latin, essentially. And because of that, it starts to simplify, and they drop gendered nouns. So that's why we do not have gendered nouns in modern English. So even though English goes underground, it's estimated, because it goes underground, rather, it's estimated that about 85% of the original vocabulary is lost.
Oh, wow.
What eventually does prevail, well, we lost a lot of words. In 1204, is when King John, notorious for being also pretty bad at his job, like Ethelred the Unready before him, he loses the French part of Normandy to the King of France. And now the Norman lords are kind of just stuck in England, and they can't go back and forth. A lot of them were ruling in absentia from France. Now they have to come in. And then we get the start of the 100-Year War, which particularly went on for about 100 years, starting in 1337. And French becomes the language of the enemy. Now it's not so cool to speak French. And then we get this other, I don't know, you may have heard of it, big deal thing, the Black Death.
Oh, yeah, that's a good thing.
It kills off a third of the English population, which was around 4 million at the time. And because they were ministering to the sick, it kills off a disproportionate number of the Latin-speaking clergy. So after the plague, you get all this English-speaking laboring and merchant class folks growing in economic and social importance. So for those of you who don't know, what happens is after the Black Death, and you lose all these people, there's a labor shortage. I don't know, this might sound familiar, just spitballing here. So people start to kind of, unionize and stuff. If it feels familiar, it's because history repeats itself, as it turns out. Anyway, so there's this big push. And because of that, the laboring class and the merchant class, they all speak English. So within literally a decade, the linguistic division between the nobility and the commoners ends.
Wow, so this is just a big period of change with all that's going on, basically, right?
Yeah, it all happens almost like simultaneously.
Yeah.
And this is when you have Chaucer, who's starting to write in English as well. So you have the first popular author writing in English. So the Middle English is emerges in this 13th century, but really solidifies in the 14th century. And it's when stuff starts to sound more familiar. So I'm going to read you a little Chaucer. This isn't actually Chaucer. This is from a travelogue. Sorry.
Okay.
This is from a travelogue that is very funny. We'll see if you can make heads or tails of it.
All right.
In that land been trees that bear in wool, as though it were of ship, whereof men making clothes, and all things that may be made of wool.
Describing somebody's something about a sheep, like
so basically he's imagining a land that you go to where you can take wool off trees.
Oh, okay.
That been trees that bear in wool.
Okay.
And it's being shared like sheep.
Okay, I got the shep part, I think, and there was like hair, like wool, but okay, yeah,
I will say I was pronouncing it in a more modern way as well. It wouldn't have sounded even that clear if you were time traveling, because we're pretty great vowel shift, but you start to be able to get to English that we can read pretty handily. Okay. And if you read that, you would have been able to make out even more of it.
Okay.
Brings us to my man, the myth, the legend, Geoffrey Chaucer, who I do a whole talk on Chaucer. Maybe we'll talk about him one day if you're up for it. Chaucer is a fascinating guy. We have more documentation on him than we do on Shakespeare because he worked for the crown. So we know a ton about him, but all we need to know for the purposes of today is that he was a very popular writer. His stuff would have been read in pubs. The literate people in town would have read it to the non-literate people. And because he wrote in English, he has a bunch of words that were first found in his work, English words that we haven't seen anywhere before, like absent, digestion, finally, flute, heater, vulgar, wallet. So 20 to 25% of his vocabulary was French, but the new words were probably mostly everyday words in English that just had never been written down before. Literacy rates, by the way, at this point, because someone usually asks me if I'm doing the talk, are between 2 to 50%. We don't know.
It's a big range.
It's a huge range. We actually have no idea how many people were reading, because a lot of people think now we were underestimating the literacy rate. So,
Do you think it was probably more like a group activity, or like someone would read aloud to?
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Because we see that even in the 1800s, right? More in your era of study, that people would bring a newspaper or something. Because you don't have TV, so you might as well, even if you could read, you might not have been as strong of a reader. You would have had this thing that happened. This happens a lot later historically, but it was called having your letters, which meant that you could distinguish letters. So you could do more than sign your own name. Like you could probably make out like a C-spot run level of reading, but having your letters is not necessarily what we would call modern literacy. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
So just very quickly, little itty bitty bit of Chaucer.
Okay.
When that April was sure suit, when April with its the drought of March hath pierced to the root, and bathed every vein in sweet liquor. When April with its sweet-smelling showers has pierced the drought of March to the root, and bathed every vein of the plants in such liquid.
Okay, I got the April and March part, and I was like, are we talking about rain here, or the weather? And okay, that makes sense. And then, the liquor, but that's obviously just the metaphor for water, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So he's very distinguishable, very understandable. It's hard sometimes to read this stuff now, but I encourage people to find modern translations of Canterbury Tales, only because some of it's very funny. And the things that we have found funny, I'm going to say a mildly rude word on my podcast, is that we have always found butts hysterical. Butts in Canterbury Tales. People get mooned constantly. Humans have always had the same sense of humor. So, which brings us back to religion. We're circling around again because Chaucer does talk a lot about religion. Canterbury Tales is about a religious journey, obviously. So let's talk about the Bible, because in 1384, John Wycliffe produces his translation of the Bible in vernacular English, which is a huge challenge because Latin is supposed to be the language of God. It was considered a revolutionary act at the time. It's banned, it's burned, but it does continue to circulate unofficially from there on, which puts the Bible in the hands of the people for the first time. Because remember, most people did not speak Latin, and they were being preached to, and the Bible was being read in Latin. So often you would go to church and not understand much of what was being said. So that starts to change. There's 1,000 English words that are first recorded in this version of the Bible. A lot of them are Latin-based, and a lot of them come from French as well. But barbarian, birthday, canopy, childbearing, all of these words come from there and more. So this is more instruction of English.
Wow.
Big old vowel shift. Have you heard of the Great Vowel Shift?
Yes, I have.
Very exciting. It happens very slowly.
Okay.
15th, 16th, and 17th century. It's a result of long vowel sounds begin to be made higher and further forward in the mouth. So I'm going to ask you a question, Joe. Here's pop quiz. Where
Sure.
does your tongue sit in your mouth when you're not talking or eating?
I guess at the bottom, but on my teeth, like my bottom.
It probably rests if you relax your jaw right now.
Okay, we'll relax.
The
All right.
tip of your tongue is probably right behind your two top teeth in the middle.
Yeah.
That is an English speaker thing. Where your tongue rests depends on your mother tongue.
Oh, cool.
Quite literally. So that's not a universal thing, but for most English speakers, when you're relaxed, it sits up there. And that is probably partially a result of these long vowels coming into shape. So shep becomes me as may, mine as mean, shire as sheer, mate as mat, mode as mood. So we get all these starting to change vowels. We don't really know why it shifted. And this is another example of why spelling in English is terrible, because sometimes the spelling changed to reflect the new pronunciation, but often it just didn't. Why food and blood are pronounced differently.
Yeah.
Spelled the same, but shove and move. And this is also when we just stopped pronouncing a lot of those letters. Like night used to be knite, knee used to be knee, gnaw becomes gnaw, comb.
Wow.
We start dropping all those letters during the Great Vowel Shift. And we don't know why that happened, but boy, does it make it really hard to learn English.
So here's my thing. How I think did scholars and people who studied language only know this happened, or is this like a kind of a more modern, like, oh, people realized and they gave it this Great Vowel Shift name? Were people or is this like a recent thing that someone came up with 60 years ago? Is my question.
That's a really good question. I don't have the answer to it. I could speculate, but I don't know. I would imagine it's you'd have to have some history behind you to take a look to see it happening.
Okay. And then how they figured it out would probably also be like super fascinating for me, because I'm assuming you probably had to look at things like things that would rhyme, or like this rhyme with that. So, but that's just me speculating here. I think
I'm sure there's some of that, and some of it you can trace from modern accents. So I'll talk about that in a second. Which is
cool. Okay.
I have a little bit about that in a second. But right after the Great Vowel Shift, then we get the most famous English writer of all time. Goes up. So he's post Great Vowel Shift. He is modern English. We're squarely in modern English. He's early modern English. But we can look at a word in a Shakespeare play and know how it's pronounced. Not true 100% of the time with Chaucer. Sometimes you'll look at Chaucer and be like, oh, sheep. And someone's like, no, shape. And you're like, so we know how he was pronouncing stuff. Of course, we know that Shakespeare's introducing a ton of words, some of which he may have made up, some of which were probably in vogue at the time, and he just happened to be the only one to record that survives. We get a ton of Latin being brought in at this point, because Latin becomes also not just the language of religion, but the language of science. Mm-hmm. Educated men learned Latin. Some educated women as well, but the people doing the bulk of the work at this time were allowed to be men. So you get species, militia, radius. That's why it's the language of medicine as well. So a lot of those words are Latin. This is when Latin finally has a huge, huge impact on English, is actually mostly through science. And they filled in gaps where there's no adjective available for an existing Germanic noun, like marine for sea, pedestrian for walk, or again, additional synonyms. So you get masculine and feminine in addition to manly and womanly, which would have existed at the time. And this penchant for classical languages also winds up influencing how words are spelled. Again, like doubt. They just both have silent B's because it would have been, they had Latin roots, debitum and dubitare were the Latin roots. So we just kept the B even though we don't say it.
Okay, well, I mean, that makes sense. And,
I hope, if nothing else, this podcast makes everyone feel better who ever got a bad grade on a spelling test.
So it makes me feel better, because continue to not be the very good speller to this day.
I'm awful. I'm a terrible speller. I read whole word. Something else big happens around this time, which is we get the printing press, which starts to standardize a lot of things. Spelling takes a while to be standardized, but it starts with the printing press. It doesn't come to England until 1476. It's invented by Johann Gutenberg in 1450. So it takes almost 20 years to get to England. So at the time, there's still a ton of dialects of English, because you have these like remote areas and they just have their own dialects. But this is when we start to see things get standardized. At this point, when the press is introduced, some words have up to 30 spellings. Shakespeare himself signs his name differently on almost every document we have. Like, it's spelled differently in almost every document we have signing. So around 1430 onward, they start to try and do some standardization of spelling. Long spelled thorn E, so the runic thorn E, printers went with THE for the, because there's no runic characters available for the presses. So this is when we lose the thorn.
Oh, okay.
Yep, thorn goes goodbye. Some people start using the Y to mimic that other thorn-like character, which led to ye, as in ye old language. And that was how the was actually pronounced at the time. So even if it was spelled THE, it was pronounced ye. U and V used to be interchangeable in Middle English. And they only slowly at this time become established as a vowel and a consonant. Same with I and J. This is when they start to become separate sounds. Names are rendered in a different way, a billion times. I'm sorry, it wasn't just when Shakespeare wrote down. It was people writing about Shakespeare, so there actually is 80 different spellings of Shakespeare's name on record.
Oh, wow.
He spelled it differently in each of his 6 known signatures. So obviously, Shakespeare brings in tons of phrases, tons of words, and the Bible comes up again not long after him, because in 1611, we get the King James Version of the Bible, which is the first official English language approved Bible. Royal says it's okay. It's put together by 54 scholars and clerics. It's still one of the most predominantly used translations of the Bible in English. And if some of the language sounds a little archaic to anybody in the King James Bible, it was actually kind of archaic back then, and it was intentional to make it sound like a little more formal.
Oh, okay. So just, putting on some airs to
yeah, so
good, I guess.
I have this passage, which I have from Wycliffe. Remember, he wrote the illicit one in 1384. And I'm going to modernize the pronunciation because some of the spelling's kind of wild. When I talk about non-standardized spelling, Jesus here is spelled Ghesus. The 13.
Okay. You're creative. I like it.
And Jesus saying the couple went up to an hill, and when he was set, his disciples came into him. King James translation is, and seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain, and when he was set, his disciples came unto him. So we're pretty close. They probably actually looked at the Wycliffe translation. There was one in the middle too by this guy named Tyndale, which was banished even harder. But they definitely based the modern they based the King James version probably on the Tyndale, even though it was technically banned. We also get our first dictionary in 1604 by a guy named Robert Caudry. But the first dictionary that people considered reliable doesn't come until 1755. So pretty late in the game.
Yeah, wow.
A 43,000 word dictionary, and it was the preeminent English dictionary until what? Here's your quiz. Pop quiz, Joe. What is the most comprehensive English dictionary?
I would say the one from that Oxford put together, the OED.
Correct. And that would not be published till 150 years after Johnson's.
Oh, wow.
So even though the Oxford English Dictionary is old, it is pretty modern in terms of actual English. We start getting grammars around this time, solidifying modern grammar. So again, grammar in English as a formal way of being taught does not happen until the 1700s.
Wow.
And the guy who wrote A Short Introduction to English Grammar in 1762 is the one who is the main source of correct grammar rules that we still hold to this day, like that a double negative always yields a positive, that you don't end a sentence with a preposition, and you do not split an infinitive. Robert Lewis, so our grammar is from 1762.
Yeah. Some rules are still in place.
And then this is when the language goes bananas because of colonization, right? Because Britain is a huge naval power. They're traveling internationally, and everywhere they go, they're taking words. So there is a kind of a fun joke that you'll often find in like English grammars that I love, which is that English is a language that chases other languages down dark alleys, beats them up, and steals spare grammar out of their pockets. But it can feel that way. So here's a short list of some words that we have taken over time from different places that England was colonizing or just trading with. So from French, we get bizarre, valet, crew. Italian, fiasco, arsenal, casino. Spanish, armada, bravado, cork. Portuguese, breeze, tank, marmalade. German, kindergarten, children's garden, right? Noodle, bum, dumb, dollar. Dutch and Flemish, we get dame, damn, rather, booze, hunk, pole, knapsack, sketch. Basque, we get bizarre, which I love, and anchovy. Norwegian, the maelstrom, iceberg, ski. Icelandic, we get mumps and saga. Finnish, we get sauna. Persian, we get shawl, lemon, caravan, tambourine. Arabic, we get jar, magazine, algebra. We actually got all of algebra from the Arabic languages. Algorithm, almanac. We get Turkish, coffee, yogurt, caviar, horde. Russian, sable, mammoth. Japanese, we get tycoon. Samurai. Malay, we get bamboo, amok. caddy.
Amok.
Chinese, we get tea and typhoon. In Polynesian, we get taboo and tattoo. That is a small sample. You can see how all of these words start to amalgamate into an enormous language with a ballooning vocabulary. And then another really important thing happens to make the distinction between early modern and late modern English. It's a whole time period. Do you have an idea, Joe? I'm putting you on the spot.
I would just say, going by like kind of where we are on the timeline, I would just say science is really advancing and you have a revolution. So I imagine you need a lot of words to describe all these new mechanical things and the scientific principles behind them, I would say.
Bingo bango. Absolutely correct. Industrial and the scientific revolution change English in an enormous way and brings it into late modern English, the English that we recognize. All these words for new things like train, engine, reservoir, pulley, combustion, piston, and old words get new meanings like vacuum and cylinder and pump. And new words are created by amalgamating and fusing existing English words like railway, horsepower, typewriter, cityscape, airplane. And then they do a bad thing and they send some people over to America from England, and the language changes a lot. American English is notably different from British English, right? What's interesting is that some English pronunciations and usages freeze when they come to America, meaning the language continues to change in Britain, but it stays the same here. So we still use the word fall, but the British say autumn. We say trash for rubbish, hog for pig, sick for ill, yes for thief, for lend. These are all old English words that we hung on to.
Oh.
In England. So it's not a case of us corrupting, it's a case of us, in some cases, not letting go of. The Puritans are conservative in their adoption of native words, so we don't get a ton of language from the indigenous people of America, but a lot of them that we do have are for animals and foods, like raccoon, possum, moose, chipmunk, skunk, tomato, squash. But these words are often really mangled, so squash actually comes from the word counterquash or osquasha. Raccoon is from, I'm going to butcher this, I apologize, ragrukun, and hickory is probably from paucho hikora. So these were Native American words that were taken and mangled. And there's a really big impact on American English by a group of people that didn't even want to be here. So enslaved people brought over from Africa started with just 20 in 1619, and by the Civil War we have 4 million enslaved people. And these captured people did not come over here speaking English, obviously. They were speaking their language, but they had to communicate with these people who had captured them, so they create what we call pigeons, which are grammatically simplified means of communication developed between 2 or more groups that don't have a language in common. If you've ever seen an alien movie where someone puts their hand and goes, Veronica, and then you put your hand on your chest and you go, Joe, we're trying to create a pigeon, right? Because if you can strip language down to your basics, you can sometimes manage some communication. So that's what pigeons were. So these were like combined languages. And the longer the enslaved people spent in America, the more the pigeon becomes what we call a Crail. The Crail is a stable natural language that develops from simplifying and mixing different languages at a fairly sudden point of time. So arguably Yiddish could be a Crail, for instance. Gullah is an English African patois, and it's really has apparently changed very little in the last 2 or 3 centuries. And it changed how white slavers spoke as well. So there's a lot of influence back and forth. I can't play the video obviously right now, but one of the interesting things, I promised you I was going to talk about accents. The Southern accent is actually probably closer to how Shakespeare talked than how modern English people talk.
Oh, cool.
So again, in the case of that freezing, Southern accent, if you slow it down a little bit or speed it up in certain ways, it's a really great video on YouTube. I'll try and put links in the show notes. This professor does a way better job of explaining it. It's very close to how they think Shakespeare would have spoken. It's the accent in England that moves on and evolves, and it's the accent that's frozen in the American South.
Very cool.
And there's a really great TikTok out there of this guy who's got kind of like a very down-home Southern accent doing the Brutus speech to Caesar and from Shakespeare, and it's so good. He's like in his car, and he's just kind of doing it off. It sounds like he's doing it off the cuff, but he has it memorized, so obviously, and it sounds so good. It's like so genuine, and you can really hear how it might have sounded, which is very cool. There's a ton of English involved, creoles, something like Spanglish, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Modern English as a language, one of the reasons it's hard to teach is very reliant on emphasis. So this is my favorite. You ready, Joe?
Okay.
I never said she took my money. 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 I never said she took my money.
All different implications there.
Right. 6 sentences from 6 words. Which makes it incredibly hard to teach somebody. Try explaining that to somebody.
Yeah.
There was a really terrible comedy a bunch of years ago. I don't know, maybe it wasn't terrible. Gwyneth Paltrow was in it, I think, called Up in the Air. And there's only one line in it that my husband and I say to each other all the time because we both saw it. And it's Mike Myers going, "I put the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable." I got that all the time with English. It's so hard to teach English to people. It's so unfair. The nuances, the spellings are very hard to communicate.
But now we know why today, because we've seen the history.
Right. And now we've got this new thing, which is that language doesn't stop evolving. So radio, television, telephones bring all this new words, and now we have internet memes and internet speak coming in. LOL, OMG, IRL, things that we say now in sentences that were abbreviations that mean nothing, right? Like, what's the linguistic origin of that? They mean things, and they're powerful usage. One of the reasons I love doing this conversation, hopefully, is I think there's a real allergy to like modern slang. Whenever time period you're in, people get very fussy about slang. But that's just language. It's just language. It just evolves. Like, there was a huge thing when we're about the same age. Do you remember the controversy over Ebonics? People freaked out.
Mm-hmm.
Ebonics is a very natural language evolution, and it's very close to what we were talking about with a Crail, where you have this smashing of two old languages together, and it's very natural for stuff to evolve and to sound different place to place. Think of the roots of English, where we were talking about having all of these dialects.
Mm-hmm.
The unification of the English language as we know it today is because of television and radio. And now we're starting to get a flattening of accent because of it. When we think of saying someone has no accent, we don't really mean they have no accent. We mean they sound like someone from Los Angeles on television.
Yeah.
That's the no accent, which is really fascinating. We have this desire to flatten our accents. And of course we get, modern phrases like selfie, like a boss. I can't even, I have all the feels. And for a piteous tiny little language from a tiny little island, English is the most widespread language in the world. It's more widely spoken and written than any other language. Out of the world's approximately, this has increased since last time I looked at these notes, I said 7.5, but I think we're firmly at 8 billion inhabitants now.
Yeah.
5 billion people speak English. That's 20% of the English population, of Earth's population.
Wow.
There's other languages that are spoken by more people, but it's pretty predominant. Because here's the difference. 1.5 billion people speak English, but only 360 million speak English as their first language.
Wow.
Nuts, right?
Yeah, I think that's a real testament to how, it's spread all over the world.
Yeah, so that means about over 700 million people speak English only as their second language. They actually outnumber almost 2 to 1 people who have English as their first language.
Yeah.
Mostly due to colonialism, because England just spread colonies so vastly and successfully and held them for so long that it became predominant. But language shifts and languages die. In the last 20 years, 54 languages had their very last speaker die.
Wow.
So, one day we too will be the statue in the desert.
Yep.
So any thoughts, Joe? I know I just threw 2,000 years of history at you.
Yeah, I know. We did it pretty quickly. We did it in a, I think we covered it very efficiently. This is the kind of stuff that fascinates me as someone who enjoys history. Seeing these kind of both big changes and patterns that repeat over time. And like you said, it's we're still on this course, in which is not stopping. The biggest drivers today, probably. Online communication and all we gave some examples of all those little abbreviations that people use and know now, and that's just it. People might say, well, something like LOL is so informal, but it's just the next step, and it might be informal, but hey, you know what? All these things, they were also informal at one point.
It was we did Underland for One Town, One Book this year, and one of the things they were talking about was how difficult it was to come up with a sign to mark radioactive waste, so that people for centuries and thousands of years would know not to dig it up.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things they were talking about was trying to use symbols, which seems really obvious, right?
Yeah.
But they realized that symbols decay too. So my favorite example of this is if you use Microsoft Office, which most people have to at some point, right? What's the button for save, Joe?
The little floppy disk icon.
Right. Does your kid know what a floppy disk is? Because mine 100% does not.
When's the last time you had a computer? The laptop I'm recording on today, of course, doesn't have a floppy disk reader, and a lot of the computers don't come with them nowadays. So there we go. There's a great example of something
That's
very
a decaying symbol, right? How much longer will they be able to keep that as the symbol for save? Except that people will just start knowing it just as the symbol for save, right?
Yeah.
Just like the triangle button is the symbol for play. I don't know why that's the symbol. Do you?
I always assumed it suggested moving forward, and the double triangle is fast forward because it suggested, well, we're going twice as fast as the one triangle.
You know what I would love to know, because on the remote controls that we got when we first got VCRs, right? Because VCRs are relatively new. They're gone now. That's how fast technology moves. But really, in the way of technology, relatively new idea, right? All the remotes had that word on it under the symbol, right? It would say fast forward. At what point did we say we don't need the words anymore because the symbol is so known?
Oh, yeah. There's another, and that's a whole, great point that, even symbols can decay and die off, and the little what we think of as universal, the red circle with the dash through meaning no, that might not mean no in 100 years, 200 years.
Right, and it relies on color symbols, which we know are not the same from place to place. Red is a wedding dress color in other countries. And white is the color of death. You wouldn't wear white to a wedding, and I think I want to say Japan or India. I'm probably spoofing that, but you know what I mean? I think it's just, we assume things are universal that in fact don't leave our little tiny circle. But at the same time, we are using some words that the people who wrote Beowulf used. So that's continuity is still there. And English is a relatively young language. It is a young language. It's, for such a predominant language, it's a very young one. So the fact that we can even tell its history in the course of an hour-long podcast kind of tells you that, because you certainly, I don't think, could do that with the evolution of Chinese, which is a far, far older language, or any of the Indo-Chinese languages, which are, rooted in prehistory. So we have a little baby language. It's changed a lot. Be nice to it. Have some sympathy for people trying to learn to speak it. It ain't as easy as it sounds.
For sure.
But thank you for joining me today, Joe. Do you have any final thoughts? Anything you want to plug?
Oh, thanks for bringing me along for the ride today. Like I said, I enjoy all things history, and that's the great part about history. We can always keep on learning, always keep on picking up all these cool little facts to impress our friends with at cocktail parties, like I said before. So, thanks for having me.
Next time you'll come by and you'll tell me a story.
Sure.
We'll take turns storytelling, because local history is fascinating as well. If you are interested in Rockland County history, our last episode was an oral history episode with Brian Jennings, which I recommend giving a listen to. Lots of tips on how to conduct oral history interviews with your relatives, if you happen to be in the area with them. This is going to come out post the holidays. I just realized as I was saying that, but they may still be hanging around. Who knows?
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Joe, for listening to me babble about something I'm passionate about for a while.
Oh, I'm happy to listen.
All right, and thanks to you guys at home for listening, and just remember, read on.